Hold on. Good evening, everyone. Well, tonight I'm actually really fascinated to be speaking to my guest, Steve Sweeney. First time I've had him on for an interview, or the first time we've actually chatted. Morningstar international editor, founder of Media Workers for Palestine, a staunch anti-imperialist, and one of very few real journalists that goes to the places that he talks about. Steve, welcome.
Thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure.
What absolutely blew my mind, I was sort of browsing, I think I was browsing through Twitter, and I saw a clip of your interview with RT about your recent, what I can only describe from my perspective, suicidal trip into Lviv, the headquarters of Azov and Aidar and all of the Nazi and ultranationalist elements inside Ukraine, and jam-packed, I'm guessing, with legacy media people such as Oz Kataji, the same Syria crowd, basically. Why did you decide to do this? How did you get into Lviv? And tell us a bit about the actual process of getting in.
I mean, okay, the process of getting in was the easy part. It was the getting out that was the harder part.
Yeah.
We'll probably come onto that a little bit later. But
Mm.
I mean, the reason that I went really to Lviv was the very reason that you outlined in your introduction, that Lviv and Kiev are full of legacy media organizations. So you have BBC, ITV, Channel 4, CNN, NBC, Sky News, you have the Telegraph, the Times, the Guardian, etc., etc. All of these kind of news organizations that have been based in Ukraine since February, and all of them are producing identikit reports.
Yeah.
And these identikit reports, by the way, don't deviate one millimeter from the official narrative, which is the government line, the pro-British government line, the pro-US government line, and the pro-NATO line. So, we had this kind of, this news reporting that I knew wasn't really reflecting reality on the ground, because, I, as a journalist, follow other journalists on that don't work for the mainstream media that are reporting the truth. People like Eva Bartlett, Patrick
Mm.
Lancaster, who have been doing some incredible journalism from the eastern part of Ukraine, and I'll talk a little bit about their work
Yeah.
later, actually, because I think it's quite important. As a journalist, for me, it's very important to report the truth. The truth matters, right?
Mm.
And what I found, in particular with Ukraine, is that those that get close to the truth, people like Eva and Patrick, who I mentioned, are then put at serious risk. So Eva, as we know,
Yeah.
has been placed on a government kill list.
Mm.
Incredibly serious. The same for Patrick Lancaster. There's
Mm.
been, this has been whipped up as well. People asked to hunt him down and to kill him. And we kind of, these threats should be taken very seriously, because I've spoken about this a number of times before, but the case of Anatoly Shary, who is a journalist, and he's a political opposition leader. He has his own party, the Shary Party, in Ukraine, who was forced into exile, I think, in 2012.
Mm.
But last month, he was arrested in Spain, where he was in a joint sting operation, not just with the Spanish police, but with the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence services. And he's been charged with high treason. Now, this is incredibly worrying. High treason is often met with a bullet in Ukraine. The situation there deteriorated so much now that under martial law, or they're using martial law as an excuse to, for all sorts of atrocities, including the shooting dead of one of their own peace negotiators.
Yeah.
But this means that that people aren't safe. They aren't safe and free to report. Where it's it sends that message that wherever you are, in Europe or across the world, an intelligence service that has been likened to Hitler's SS can hunt you down and they want to bring him back to Kiev. So I mean, the situation is very, very serious for journalists. So I wanted to start by paying tribute to those that are on the ground, doing that work. And I mean, the reason I went there again was, like I said, we're in the situation in the British media where almost any story now, as long as it has the caveat says Ukraine at the end of it, is gives the press almost like a free for all to report anything, no matter how wild, no matter how lacking in evidence. And I spoke in a previous interview actually on this, and I was talking about a couple of stories that I highlighted. One, this which was one of the most recent, was about the 200 dead bodies that were found in an apartment block in Mariupol, and this was reported as fact, even though there was no photographic evidence of the dead bodies. We didn't know when the dead bodies were found, where they were found, and there was no independent verification other than a local official, had said that this was happened. Now, I've seen mass graves, in Iraq. I've seen mass graves in Lebanon, and there's plenty of corroborating evidence. You can't hide. There's not the kind of thing that you hide. But there was another similar story that Eva Bartlett exposed when 9,000 dead bodies in a mass grave. And I think the reporting in Britain and the West was predominantly focused on where there was kind of aerial shots and satellite images.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But Eva went to the site and she found there was no evidence to suggest that that this had even, you can't hide 9,000 bodies, right? I mean, it's just absurd. So that was kind of, well, I thought, well, there's plenty to suggest that things aren't quite as they're being reported in the mainstream media. I have a distrust of healthy distrust of the mainstream media. So I made my way into Lviv. Now, I'm an accredited journalist for a national daily newspaper in Britain. People might not like the newspaper; they might disagree with what we say, but I'm still an accredited journalist, which kind of should allow me access to report freely and independently. So I first arrived in Poland. I was in Warsaw, and I spent some time there. And I could talk a little bit about that actually, because there's some interesting things come out of that after. But I made my way into Lviv on a coach, and I thought, well, can I like to experience the whole, the whole kind of feeling of getting inside, getting into the country and traveling with civilians, and I thought that I might get some kind of experience on the coach, and I did. But not the kind of experience that I was perhaps expecting. When I was looking at the person opposite me, who was sitting opposite me on the coach, was in military fatigues and had a tattoo of a gun on his face. And while we don't judge by appearances, I think it's probably safe to say that he wasn't there on some kind of peace or mercy mission, entering Ukraine. And he glared at me pretty ominously pretty much throughout the whole journey. But excuse me, when I entered the country, these are the kind of people that are having the red carpet rolled out for them. So Lviv is portrayed in the West as a city or an area that's completely untouched, or almost completely untouched by by what's happening in Ukraine. But of course, it isn't, and it doesn't take much to notice this. When there's the obvious signs like the sandbags around certain things to keep them safe, and the air raid sirens, and that kind of thing. But what isn't being reported is actually it's awash with fascists and mercenaries, and this is kind of almost like a centre for I guess the Western intervention in Ukraine, and all of these people, not just mercenaries and soldiers, but weapons, arms, are coming into Ukraine via civilian transport networks
through Poland. So Poland is effectively similar to Turkey to Syria, I'm guessing.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good analogy actually, because when the jihadists were crossing into into Syria via Akçakale, which is another
Mm.
place I previously visited to find out what was happening there with the border. It's pretty much it's the same, but in a way it's it's more open because. Whereas in Turkey, they would kind of deny any links to jihadist groups or
Mm,
other
mm, mm.
other mercenary organisations, but they're almost proud of it in the West. And this call has been to go and fight on the side of Ukrainian alongside neo-Nazi forces has been made by the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
These are official calls, and they know that that there's that these mercenaries are in there, and there's never going to be any kind of recrimination. They'll probably be welcomed back as heroes if they make it back. I mean,
Mm.
that's another story. But I mean, it's fairly astonishing how open and obvious it is. I mean, you can see the signs of neo-Nazism everywhere, not just from the statues praising nationalist heroes like Stefan Bandera, who is
Mm.
now rehabilitated. This is the guy who colluded with the Nazis and was also happened to be a CIA agent as well. He was
Well, yeah, I mean, he was part of the whole Operation Gladio, presumably, to leave these Nazis behind, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe.
exactly.
But what I just want to ask you, because as you're talking, my brain's just going crazy here. So what you're basically saying is, I mean, yeah, Lviv is known to be also the military training center of these extremist battalions, these Nazi and ultra-nationalist battalions, right? So what you're describing is that the BBC and Channel 4, ITV, all the same people that were misreporting on Syria for 10, 11 years and sustaining the war in Syria as a result. This is where, their criminality is most abhorrent to me, because what they do is they maintain these wars and they ensure the deaths of civilians while they're claiming in their articles, in their news reports, that Britain is defending humanity, that it's defending these civilians, and it's absolute nonsense. I mean, East Aleppo was the perfect example of that. But so basically what you're describing is this is effectively a military intelligence NATO hub packed full of Nazis and fascists and mercenaries. I presume you mean foreign mercenaries. So it's sort of reminding me also a bit of Gaziantep in Turkey, which was the kind of jihadi express for a long time and the center of a lot of the British intelligence operations against Syria. And in amongst all this is the BBC and Channel 4 and ITV and CNN and Ozkataji and what's his name, Chris York, formerly Huffington Post, all of whom led smear campaigns against anyone who was trying to expose the truth in Syria. And now here they are embedded with what you've just described as Nazis and fascists. Right?
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty accurate description. I mean that was the thing. I mean, I mean one of the reasons I went there, I described earlier, but I was specifically trying to look at the base in Yavorov that was bombed. If you remember, quite early on. I say quite early on. I mean, the war's been raging there for 8 years, but liberals don't like to, kind of. Be told that for them everything started on February the 24th. But one of the things that I was looking at was actually this base, which has almost been brushed aside as though we bombed it. There wasn't really many people there. But this is like a NATO hub. This is that there are these kind of private security companies. I mean, I reported before February there was Blackwater's new. I mean, it's changed its name so many times now. It's Academy. Who were training neo-Nazis, and there was British troops that were also training the training forces in the eastern region. So this was something that has been very well prepared, and they can hide behind say, well, they kind of say, well, this is just a war between Russia and Ukraine, when the reality is, as I think it's even mainstream press are kind of coming around to the idea, or they've got no choice but to. I don't suppose that this really is a proxy war between NATO and Russia, and behind Russia, China. This is about defense of a unipolar world and American hegemony when they're seriously weakened, and the moment they're fearing that the dollar is going to be replaced as the world currency, and with that its control of world financial markets, this kind of thing. And none of this is none of this is even allowed to be spoken about. If you try to raise anything that's deviates even slightly from the mainstream narrative, you're attacked as a Putin apologist, whatever that means. This is a kind of nonsense kind of thing, isn't it? But for these pen wielders of imperialism, I mean, it's no mistake that the likes of, for example, just before the invasion, whatever you want to call it, on February the 24th, Paul Mason, who's a British journalist, is now wants to be elected as a Labour MP in Greater Manchester. He's put his name forward as the Right Honourable Member for NATO, we kind of joke. But it's no mistake that he went into Ukraine, into Kiev, with a number of kind of the sort of minor MPs, a couple of trade union leaders, and met with what I would call Kiev-sanctioned individuals. He met with Vladimir Klitschko and these kind of people, and then came back to Britain, and he thought he would be the voice of the Ukrainian people, and he was, and is now pushing the imperialist line, and he was trying to bring the imperialist line, the pro-NATO line, into the British trade union movement, into the progressive movement in Britain, to say, that this is some kind of war between good and evil. Everything's black and white, and we must support the Ukrainian people, and the best way to do that is to give them more arms and weapons, which happens to be the exact line of the British state, of NATO, and this kind of thing. So, but it's no mistake that they led a demonstration on the streets of London, which was met with chants of "Arm Ukraine," at the same time that Boris Johnson was carrying out his political stunt by arriving in Kiev to meet Zelensky to do exactly that. So these are kind of the useful tools of imperialism. So these kind of people are allowed a free run, excuse me, inside Ukraine, the Oz categories, the mainstream press. Whereas I was met with a very different response, in that I was told I was.
So what happened when you entered Ukraine? Did they take you to one side? What happened?
They asked me what my business was in Ukraine. They knew full well what my business was, I have to say. Now, as you're probably aware, but just for the listeners, that when you book a ticket to enter the country, it's a fairly standard thing, but you have to give your passport details and your passport number and other information. And I'm 99.9% sure, I kind of expected this, that the company would have triggered something on the system, and they probably forwarded it to the Ukrainian intelligence services. Now, in a way, I'd be surprised if they didn't do this. During a conflict, I think that I was in a way expecting it, but I think they also seem to know quite a bit about me when I arrived, so they knew about my writing. They took my friend joked with me before I came in. He's an American journalist, and he's based in Berlin, and he laughed. He told me, "Steve, your body is illegal in Ukraine," he said, and my body's been called many things, but illegal is not one of them. And he said, and I said, I didn't think about this at the time. He said, "Well, you've got a tattoo on. I'm a communist, so I have a tattoo of Marx, Engels, and Lenin on my arm."
Oh, right.
I mean, this is illegal because all communist symbols have been banned across Ukraine, and we know, the Communist Party has been banned, the Kononovich brothers have been detained, and all this, amongst the purges of communists and the left and any sort of political opponents. So they knew that I was a communist, and they said, "We know why you're here." And I said, "Okay, why am I?" They said, "You're a spy." And I'm not a spy. I'd be a pretty useless spy, I think. But no, I mean, I'm not a spy. And they said you will be tortured, you will be arrested, and indicated that I would be executed. And they told me that I would never make it out of the country. Now, um, obviously, I did because I'm here speaking to you. But I think I was incredibly lucky to get out, and I got out in amongst a group of refugees actually,
Mm.
and I just decided not to speak. I took a package of food and water and walked through, and managed to get out. And then I escaped across the border, and I made it eventually to Berlin. Although there was a hairy moment when the armed police came on the train before we crossed Germany, but they seemed a little bit interested in me for a minute. But they,
In Poland, you mean? The armed
yeah, just
police in
at the
Poland.
border,
Wow. Okay.
just at the border there. They were interested in me for a minute. But I mean, the thing that my kind of treatment is nothing compared to the
Mm.
many thousands of leftists and journalists operating in the country at great risk who are being disappeared or killed, are placed on lists like Eva,
Mm.
and threatened with their lives. So my situation doesn't compare. But what I did find in the country was, when speaking to people, I mean, I spoke to people and they were very clear. I spoke to a woman called Maria from Mariupol, or just outside Mariupol,
Mm.
and she spoke to me in kind of broken English, and I had somebody that was helping me as well.
Mm.
But the first thing she did was she showed me a picture of what was her apartment block, completely obliterated. It was
Mm.
destroyed. But she pointed and she said Azov,
Mm.
Azov. And she told me then, obviously she said who was responsible for destroying her, her home. And she'd managed to get out of Mariupol with her daughter. Her son and her husband had remained in the city. I'm hoping that everything is okay with them, because the situation was very bad. But
Mm.
she explained that the the people in Mariupol were not afraid of the Russians. She said Russian soldiers gave them food, gave them water,
Yeah.
um, and helped them. They brought medicine. I don't think they had much of it, but they gave them. They felt safe.
Mm.
And she said it was the um, Ukrainians. They were terrified. I mean, you could see the fear, and you could hear it in her voice. And she said that they tried to leave um, much earlier than they did when they got out, but they were threatened with that they would be shot dead if they tried to leave,
Mm.
and by Ukrainians, not by
Yeah.
Russians.
Yeah.
And she told me as well that most people in that part of the country are fleeing to Russia because they feel safe. And she said, I don't, she didn't feel safe in Lviv because
Mm.
she's a Russian speaker, and she said
Yeah.
that she knows. I mean, this is her country. She knows very well. But she was very clear that in Mariupol that they've been terrorized for 8 years by Nazis. The Nazis, she said, were putting um, military hardware and equipment in civilian areas.
Mm.
And I mean, this is the other thing that you see a lot of reporting in the West where they'll say something, oh, Russia has bombed a school, right?
Yeah.
Now this appeals, it's an emotional response, because the
Mm.
British public on the whole, they want the war to end, but they're horrified by this kind of thing, as anybody would be, bombing a
Yeah.
school.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow. But what they're not saying is, well, if that school was bombed, one, who bombed it, but there's just an assumption that it's
Mm.
Russia. Same with these deaths in Mariupol, by the way. The Western journalists never kind of question if there were those dead bodies in the apartment block, who killed them.
Mm.
It's just an assumption that
Yeah.
it's Russia.
Yeah.
But what they're saying is that these schools are being used as military bases, and there aren't children in them because they've all been made to leave. Many of them are being forced into bunkers by the Azov
Mm.
and the Ukrainian forces, who are threatening them there. This is and this was just one of the many stories that I heard. Another woman telling me about her neighbours. Well, now that the situation is so bad that people are fearful of their own neighbours, people that that they've grown up with, that they know, because now there's this encouragement by the Ukrainian intelligence services and the Ukrainian and the Azov and the other right-wing forces there to inform on your neighbour. This is the thing now: inform on your neighbour if they're harbouring pro-Russian sympathies, or so they're I guess there's a natural fear, but she was saying that that they're terrified of the door being kicked in the night, because this is when it generally happens. And I was talking about this dungeon, the torture dungeon, that I reported on in the back in February, that was discovered in Mariupol. I think, if I'm right, it's called, my pronunciation is probably terrible, but Bibliotech, which obviously is library. And she told me, this exists, and she said we're talking, hundreds of people that have just disappeared, presumed to be taken there and tortured by neo-Nazi forces. Now, I mean, I could talk for a long time about this and the people that I spoke to, but they had one overriding message, and that was, please, please, please tell our stories to the people in the West. They're acutely aware of how things are being framed.
It's so similar to Syria. I mean, it's really heartbreaking to hear this.
It is really, really heartbreaking. And the most heartbreaking thing about it as well is that when you do come back and try and tell these voices, you end up being, marginalized or denounced. And it was the same with Syria, actually. I remember this, that good journalists, I mean, we're talking people like John Pilger and
Robert Fisk,
all of a sudden, these people became cranks. These are award-winning journalists that that actually go, that are,
or even Seymour Hersh. I mean, his career was destroyed in Syria
because of Syria. But these are people that seekers of the truth, and they tell the truth. They don't have they're the people that actually go to the places that they're reporting on. I mean, knew the Middle East inside out, back to front. I mean, he knew that part of the world incredibly well. But but now you don't see those kind of people, because the things have narrowed so much that there is now only one acceptable narrative, and you face this reports. I did a piece on the I know others have too, but this report by BBC's Ros Atkins, who on one of they have like these short documentary shows. It was 9 minutes long, this, and it was essentially a masterclass in fascism denial, in which he then kind of deconstructed even some of the BBC's own arguments, actually, but to downplay the seriousness and the influence of Azov and Svoboda and the other right-wing forces, and was saying that they don't really have any influence in. Well, if they don't have any influence, why then is Zelensky bringing them into the fascists into the Greek parliament? Why then is he awarding their commanders the hero of Ukraine? Why is he not able to control and contain them? He went to the front and they told him to get lost when he told him to disarm. I mean, Zelensky is in many ways. I mean, he's an actor, isn't he? I mean,
absolutely. He's a very well-paid actor, and I would question his popularity within Ukraine. I mean, I think for me, I put it out on Twitter the other day. If NATO drop him, he better get out of there pretty fast, because the Ukrainian, the legitimate Ukrainian forces, I'm quite sure, that are surrendering en masse, because they realize that they've just been literally sent to their death by a guy who's capitalizing, who's running a kleptocracy in Ukraine, and who's appearing in Cannes, and totally oblivious to the actual horrors of war that he's inflicting on his own people.
I mean, this is the other thing, isn't it? That people keep. I mean, look, there's the other myth that's being, again, there's been a slight shift in that in recent, maybe the last week, actually, that Ukraine is winning the war.
Oh, yeah.
As soon as you enter the country, you know that that's not true. I don't think anybody in Ukraine would give that any kind of credibility, that Ukraine's winning the war. I mean, and if they're winning the war, why is Joe Biden, and the US government, why have they just given $40 billion to
Mm.
you know, to Ukraine.
Well, I mean, that you mentioned all of these arms coming in
Yeah,
on, as you said, public transport, etc.
sure.
And I said very early on, and I'm quite sure you picked up on that as well, is these arms aren't all staying in Ukraine, right? We know now that they're being sold on the dark web, that Syrians are coming and picking them up and bringing them into northern Syria via Turkey. And we know now, of course, there is an escalation in northern Syria from
Sure.
Turkey to secure the 30-kilometer buffer zone to basically pour the 5 million Syrian refugees from Turkey back into Syria amongst Al Qaeda affiliates. And so, this isn't all about Ukraine, is it? I mean,
Exactly.
this is about the much wider war.
Well, I think that there's two issues with that. I think,
Mm,
as you rightly pointed out, that these weapons, I mean, there's astonishing range of weapons that are being flooded into Ukraine, and
mm,
um, this is, they're going into the hands of Nazis, and there's going to be some blowback
mm.
from this, and we've already seen some of it actually. If you remember um, the massacre in the two New Zealand mosques in
Oh,
2019.
Christchurch, yes, yeah.
Yeah, Christchurch. Yeah,
Mm,
and the Trent, I forget his name. But the murderer
mm,
had previously been in Ukraine
mm.
with far right forces. He actually referenced Azov in his manifesto that he published online when he went
Yeah.
on his killing spree. We saw very recently, I think, something similar in the United States on one of the mass shootings there that had again links to Ukrainian far right
Mm,
force, or at least displayed the symbols of this. And we know that Azov want they want a white supremacist world. That's that's their words. They seek world domination. They have a network of far right activists, linked to them across the world. That's why
yeah.
after 2014, Ukraine became a haven for these people. Um, you know, and similarly, to what we're seeing in Syria. So when things come to an end, and they will do at some point, then what happens? You've
Mm.
got you've got a neo-Nazi force that the new moderate rebels. That's that's
Yeah, exactly.
as of are really essentially they're being used as a NATO proxy force, NATO's battering ram against Russia and against China. But all of a sudden you'll be left with this heavily armed neo-Nazi force, and they've been given two things that they crave the most: weapons and credibility.
Mm,
How do you reel back from that? I don't think. I don't think you can. And as you said, now these arms that are continuing to pour in. I mean, the other thing to note, by the way, is that I mentioned that there's civilian transport networks that are being used to ferry these arms around of mercenaries and soldiers. And I think Russia's showing great restraint in not bombing not destroying the civilian transport networks. I mean, um, a lot isn't kind of spoken about that. We hear a lot about Russian war crimes, as though we know for sure that Russia has committed all of the atrocities that the West and Zelensky and Kiev say that they have, and all this Russia failed to take Kiev. Well, it never planned to. I
mm,
mean, the objectives were very clear, and Russia is meeting all of its military objectives. And again, there's this while everything has been flooded with weapons to prop up the military-industrial complex. We know the 8 largest arms companies were invited into the Pentagon, to discuss the production of more arms. I mean, this is the thing. This talk of international consensus is just ridiculous. I mean, it doesn't exist. It's outside of the European Union, or Europe and the West, and even within. We're talking about those political leaders, and they're quite happy and the United States is more than happy to trash their own economies for the sake of extending this war. And you look at the statistics. I think the eurozone inflation's at 8.1%.
yeah.
Germany, powerhouse of Europe, is 7.1% is the highest inflation rate since the oil crisis of 1973. Germany is about to go in, is going to go into recession. Italy the same, 7% inflation rate. Britain, we're talking about, I was reading the news earlier this week, and they were talking about energy rationing by winter, because this desperate attempt to move. I mean, it's ridiculous, this move away from Russian oil. 5 billion is going to cost Germany to move away from this. What's happening in Russia? Well, Russia, the balance of payments for between January and April, $96 billion dollars. The biggest, I think 4 times, an increase 4 times from the same period last year. 106 billion when you look at goods and services. So the Russian economy is doing quite well, thank you very much. And they're finding that the sanctions are not having the same impact that they have done in Syria. They're not having the same impact that they've done, that they have done in in Latin American countries, where they're trying to starve people into submission, and the economic warfare that they're waging is actually having a rebound effect. And the people that are suffering are the people in the Western centres of imperialism, who are seeing their situation, the cost of living crisis and things ameliorating. So, but they don't care about it. That's the thing. That's the price that they're willing to pay, is to cripple these economies. But you're starting to see a little bit of pushback. So, for example, in Greece, you saw a general strike very recently, and they were very explicit about the strike was not just to do with the loss in terms of wages and pensions and this kind of thing, but it was also against the militarization of Greece and the involvement of NATO.
Well, I mean, Greece is being literally forced to hand over weapons, particularly from islands in the Aegean, which leaves them very vulnerable to Turkey. Because Turkey has been hovering around the oil resources or the energy resources in the Aegean for years. So it's a very, and Greece is the country that was already, I mean, raped by the EU and the IMF and so on post 2008, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
And here it is, basically forced to give up its weapons to. And the extraordinary thing, I mean, I was in Greece quite recently, and I was speaking to the elderly community right on the southern mainland coast in Lavrio, Sunio, which were areas that were occupied by Nazi forces. And many of the elderly people there were in tears, talking to me as how as 6-year-old children, they saw women and children rounded up, put into churches, and the churches were set on fire and people were burned alive. I lived next to a village in France, Oradour-sur-Glane, which was famous for the fact that the Nazis entered and did exactly the same thing, rounded up all the women and children, 242 civilians, put them in the church and set fire to the church. There were, I can't remember how many survivors, 1 or 2. So, this is, I mean, I don't know, you being there, it must have just felt quite surreal. I mean, we're not old enough to remember the Second World War, but to see that the world is being led by the media to support Nazism and fascism is, when you stop and think about it, it's quite terrifying. I mean, you talked about what I'd like to ask you. You talked about going back into Poland, and you mentioned what you saw there. Did you see there the blowback from Ukraine of Nazi and fascist elements coming back into Poland, for example?
Yes and no. I mean, there's 2 elements to it, really. So one is obviously Poland has fallen into the hands of of right-wing forces. It's got a right-wing government, and it's, as you'll see now, it's very kind of gung-ho in its anti-Russian positioning, and it really wants to, it's kind of leading the charge against against Russia on in terms of restrictions on oil and sanctions. And what you're seeing now is there's military exercises across Poland, on the particularly in the border areas. They've started to escalate kind of military exercises. So there was messages coming out when I was there saying, stay off these roads at such and such a time, and NATO forces are there en masse, and you can't, even in Warsaw, you can see a lot of Canadians, for some reason, I don't know why, there was quite a high percentage of Canadian troops there. So you're seeing a bit of a mix with the Ukrainians that are leaving the country. Now, I met, there was a number of demonstrations in Warsaw when I was there. One was a very kind of coordinated, I think EU funded demonstration, which was the same kind of setup that you've seen in other places, calling for more arms for Ukraine and this kind of stuff. And no fly zone was the call at that particular time. But I was quite encouraged to find some anti-war activists in. If you've been to Warsaw, they were by the kind of the main square, the central station, and they were handing out leaflets. And I managed to speak to them. One of them happened to be from previously lived in London, and his English was immaculate. So I was very lucky.
Excellent.
So we could have a good political conversation. And he was saying that. That there's kind of been a bit of a turn in that while the political leaders are very much, in Poland you can buy I was in Carrefour, the French.
Yeah.
I found far right newspapers in amongst all the.
God.
That's how normalised this kind of. And I was shocked. The anti-communism was just. It was dripping everywhere. So I was, but I was encouraged to see these people, and they said that there's been some anti-militarization and anti-NATO demonstrations in Poland that they'd organised, and they said that they were well received even by the Ukrainian refugees, and they'd attended the demonstrations. So I'm assuming that, that because there's a very big difference between the Ukrainian refugees that are leaving from the east.
Yeah.
I don't know. Obviously, I have, but I'm presuming that they made up a large percentage of the people that were attending the demonstrations. And I did speak to people in there, and Ukrainians too, and understandably, they want an end to war. They want to be able to live in their country in peace, and they're quite angry about. And one of the things actually that one person I spoke to was most angry about was that before February, and we're going back, talking about eight years ago, there was a situation, because people always talk about, well, how do we get to a peaceful resolution? Well, peaceful resolution's been on the table since 2015, since the Minsk Accords were signed, were agreed. So, the basis for it, the framework for it was there. In sort of November and December last year, Russia outlined its legitimate security demands to, and the United States wouldn't even look at them. They just said, brushed it off. So they were gearing towards war. There was a road to peace, a road to war, and NATO, the United States, chose the road to war. And I think that's the Ukrainians that I spoke to were very angry about this. They're very, very clear where the responsibility for this war lies. They weren't particularly pissed off with Zelensky per se, because I think they're disappointed in him, actually, because he was elected on a ticket of resolving the conflict in the Donbass and bringing peace to Ukraine and this kind of thing, and a break from the from the parties of the old and the leader, the previous leaders. But he's let them down in that in that respect, because he's been pulled. The Americans, the United States and Britain won't allow him to sign a peace deal. He can't control the fascist forces. He's not in control of Ukraine. That's incredibly clear. This is a side issue, but I did have a little chuckle the other day when there was something in the news saying that I think they were trying to portray him as, oh, look at him, he's a family man, he's a regular guy like you. And they were saying his wife, I think, said, yeah, he takes military advice from our son, our 9-year-old son. And I was like, wow, that says a lot. But that was that was the kind of the overriding thing from the Ukrainians that I met. And again, they were telling me similar stories that I've told before, of the horrors that they've been subjected to for the past 8 years since the war began, and they're they want to go back. They want to go back to Ukraine. They don't want to be in Poland or Germany or Britain or anywhere else that people are, are being welcomed with open arms. By the way, in a very different way than than the Syrians that were forced to leave their country by
Yeah.
the Western
Yeah.
jihadists. So I mean, the two situations are very similar, but I think the response has been
Totally different. Yeah, very, very different. So when you actually entered Ukraine, did you manage to get further inside Ukraine, or were you kind of no? Okay, fine.
No, I mean that was the plan. I mean,
Right.
in a way, it was a bit stupid, but I sometimes I do these kind of things. Really, I don't. But my plan was, I thought, well, I wanted to go in via Lviv, and I was going to go down to Kiev and then across. I wanted to go to Odessa and then see if I could get to Mariupol and the Donbass. But these were my kind of great plans, and partly motivated because I know that the world's media are ensconced in these places. But when I was in, for example, I was in Caracas a few years ago when Guaido was launching his his kind of one of his flopped attempts to do
Yes.
there, one of the many. But
Yeah.
it was quite funny. But Orla Guerin, who's the BBC, one of the BBC's foreign correspondents, she was there at the time. She was reporting, from a Guaido rally, and there was a handful of people there, but she tried to they were heralding this as a new dawn for Venezuela.
It's extraordinary. I mean, this is exactly what happened, of course, in Syria, in Libya, in every single place. I mean, people really need to understand it's literally staging.
It's propaganda.
Yeah, yeah,
They're playing their role in an attempt to dislodge, in a coup. So I remember saying I tried to contact Orla, and because I was at a demonstration in support of the government in opposition to Maduro, which had probably about 1 million people there. People from barrios and trade unions, and the communists were there, political parties, everybody, everybody who was everybody was there. It was like this, and the BBC didn't even cover it. So, and she was talking about, there's no food on the shelves, and I walked around the city and I filmed all the food on the shelves. CNN was saying there's something like there's no toothpaste. They were coming out with all these crazy things that just weren't true. So I messaged her and said, I'd kind of like to meet up and compare notes because we're in the same city, but we're seeing completely different things. And obviously she didn't do that. She ignored me. She did say that it was impossible to cover both the demonstrations, Guaido and the Maduro rally. One, that tells me two things. One, that meant that the BBC had made a political choice.
Yeah,
to cover
exactly.
it. But two, she was lying because I told her that I walked between the two of them on the day, and it took me 15 minutes. So I mean, it was really easy to do. But I mean, the point. I mean, that was a long kind of way of making the point that that I knew then that what we were being told about these cities, Lviv and Kiev, wasn't based on reality. I mean, they're probably leaving the hotel. So I wanted to go into those cities just to find that out as well, and I got my answer much quicker than
So, I mean, were they very aggressive with you?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, they were. I mean, I've been in situations. I've been in jail in Mexico, Turkey, bunged me in prison with some ISIS fighters, and they interrogated me and threatened me, this kind of thing. But
my God,
I've never felt as threatened before and actually fearful. I mean, in those situations, I was like pissed off and I was bored and whatever, and it was an inconvenience. But this, I really genuinely believed that they would kill me. I have no doubt about that. Absolutely none whatsoever. They would have no qualms in sometimes people quite naively, I think, are under the impression that, well, you're a British citizen, they wouldn't do anything to you. You've got a British passport.
Yeah.
Well, that's like red rag to a bull for some of them. It's a challenge. But I mean, Ukraine has, look back to whenever it was 2014, I think, Andrea Rocelli, who was an Italian photojournalist, was shot dead by the Ukrainian armed forces in the Donbass region. And they said at the time, well, he was collaborating with Russian separatists, terrorists, as they called them, and he was on the Mitrovets list, and he was found. The offices of that organisation, his photograph was found with liquidated written across it. So there was no comeback of that. I think the person that was found responsible for the killing was eventually acquitted, and cleared of all charges.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this list is just bizarre. We've got people like Steven Seagal, I think, is on it, and Gerard.
Yeah, I mean, it's just complete. It's unbelievable, actually. It's almost, as you say, it's almost. I'd almost rather be in Idlib city, I think, to some degree, because there would be a degree of respect. I mean, I did stumble onto an operating White Helmet Center in Dara in 2018 when it was still under control of the armed groups. And that was a seriously dodgy moment. I mean, I remember coming back to Damascus and the color had drained from the head of the Ministry of Media director when he realized what had happened. But, I just thought, okay, I'm just going to tell them I'm British. And it was extraordinary, the difference. The minute I said I'm British, they just started talking to me about funding, which was hilarious. Well, can I get the tap turned back on? Can I chat with James Lemessurier?
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it was, and then the head of, one of the most murderous heads of the armed groups turned up. What was his, oh God, Al-Qaeda, I can't remember his first name, but I mean, he had led the military campaign in Dada alongside Al-Qaeda and various other extremist elements and had murdered, I mean, hundreds of civilians. And he kind of cornered me and sort of said, well, where are you from? And he invited me to the protest they were going to be setting up the next day. And when I sort of made my excuses, he said, oh, well, never mind. He said, I'll call the BBC and CNN directly and send them the footage. And I was just like, but yeah, I mean.
An interesting point, though, mentioning the white helmets and, their role in kind of, as a front for the jihadist groups, but also, I mean, the White Helmet, having their an Oscar-nominated film to do this kind of thing. I mean, but and I know you've reported on this, and but again, this is another element now that has been transferred into Ukraine. The same kind of copybook from Syria is that you're seeing these innocuous sounding, or some of them are innocuous sounding, others aren't. But these organisations that are now establishing themselves as NGOs, and this is one of the things you can notice. It's very noticeable in Lviv, by the way. These kind of people that are there on humanitarian missions, or whatever, however they dress it up. And in reality, what they're doing is they're participating in on the front lines of a war. They're actively involved. In the war, and they're shipping medical equipment, but they're also shipping weapons, arms and weapons, and they're giving training. And as you reported with Mesa, he's had a long history with this kind of thing. But his Nightingale squadron, I mean,
Nightingale, yes.
Did you really?
No, I know. Well, even because you mentioned another one, Daniel Burke, and his Dark Angels, which immediately made me think of Mengele. I mean, maybe because I'm just in, I have my head in that environment in Ukraine. But I mean,
when they think these names, I mean, they're quite astonishing to choose these kind of names. But I mean, these, are actively participating. And in the case of Mesa Gifford, we know that he has extensive links to. I mean, he's admitted he's quite open about them. His links to and US intelligence. He's almost proud of them. And links to the British, the British government. So, not anybody can just all of a sudden rock up and found an NGO that's very well funded and has a fleet of.
Well, he established the recruiting website for Ukraine.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So he's not just your ordinary bod off the street in London, that's just decided to.
Certainly not. So, I mean, this is, you're seeing quite these kind of organisations. There's many of them that are actively participating, and and he openly says, "I want to create a new white helmets."
Yeah.
You can be more kind of obvious. So I mean, this is these are very obviously interventions by the West, and under the guise of humanitarian aid and NGOs. I think that's the time when you should be the most frightened, is when the NGOs arrive anywhere. That's
Yeah, absolutely.
always a troubling sign. So,
well, I mean, Palestine has been occupied by the NGO complex since the Oslo Agreement.
Yeah.
Very successfully. That was probably one of their launch projects, I think, of actually totally taking over the organization of every aspect of society and completely containing the resistance for for years.
Yeah, we saw the same in Lebanon as well.
Yeah.
With the with what happened there. That was all of a sudden the NGOs. When I was there last year, I was talking to a friend of mine from Hezbollah, and they were kind of saying that there was almost this ridiculous kind of situation where the NGOs all of a sudden flooded the squares, and there was like a battle of the squares, and they had like bigger microphones and megaphones and noise kind of drown out the real kind of and I mean, this is a typical thing. I think it was all orchestrated from the US Embassy as much.
US Embassy, and of course the same organization that really masterminded the war against Syria, which was ARC Group, Alistair Harris, who James Lemessurier worked for ARC Group when he established the White Helmets and the Free Syrian Police inside Syria, and Alistair Harris is back in Lebanon now, setting up the White Helmets in the Palestinian camps, literally the Palestine White Helmets. He's got projects in Yemen, in Iraq, so in Ukraine.
I mean,
so,
they pop up,
yeah,
it's terrifying. But they act without any kind of accountability. There's no kind of scrutiny in there.
No,
they're lauded by the Western liberal press, who treat them as some kind of heroes without.
No, it's extraordinary. Just one last question, Steve. What was your feeling? Did you feel that they felt they were winning the war?
Who? The ordinary Ukrainian?
The Ukrainian. Well, no, the mercenaries and the military, the intelligence and so on. Or did you get any feel from there? I know you weren't there for very long, but was there any feeling, anything that you picked up?
Yeah, my impression is that they know that they're losing the war.
Right.
They're absolutely, they know they are, and I think that's part of the reason that they don't want non-compliant journalists in the country, because
when
that mask slips, then so does support for the war on a world stage. And I mean, look, Russia could I think if it really wanted to, and its objectives were different, it could do a lot more. It could probably take, for example, they were talking about it failed to take Kiev. If it wanted to, it could have taken it. It didn't. But the attrition rate of Ukrainian soldiers now is incredibly high, and even Zelensky's had to admit that there's hundreds dying every day.
Yeah.
And you're now starting to see less of this triumphalism and we're winning. I mean, I know he said it on the 100th day, but nobody seriously believes that now. But when I was in Ukraine, you knew full well they knew that this was a battle they were losing. The mercenaries, I'll be honest with you, I don't think the mercenaries care one way or the other.
No, exactly. As long as they get paid, but
exactly. And they're not interested in. I mean, the people that suffer the most are the Ukrainian people.
Yeah.
And I think that I've got every sympathy with the people that are seeing their country torn apart because of the West, and because of NATO and their constant drive to war, and their drive for global hegemony, which is what this in part is about, their defense of the unipolar world. They don't care who suffers in enabling them to pursue their imperialist aims. And I think the Ukrainian people are exhausted. They're tired. I think everybody wants wants an end to the situation. But we have to really now. I think there has to be some accounting. Once the ink has dried on a peace deal, if it happens, you have to really now start looking at the role of NATO and I think its position in the world. When the Soviet Union collapsed, which in my view is one of the greatest tragedies of history, and I think that's been proven most notably in Ukraine. But the Warsaw Pact ceased to exist. Now, why didn't NATO cease to exist at that particular point? And it should have disbanded then, but instead it's increased, it's pushed further and further eastward. It's more countries have joined. Now we're looking at Finland and Sweden. I mean, Sweden, what the hell are they thinking of? 200 years of neutrality just ripped up. Putting Sweden, I think, at greater risk, and world stability at greater risk as a result of that. But I think there has to be some kind of acknowledgement, and I think the only way that there can be peace in the world, or one of the only ways, there can never be peace in the world as long as NATO exists. That's for sure.
Exactly. No, I totally agree. What are you working on next, Steve, for people to know what to look out for?
To look out for. There's a couple of things. There's a couple of stories that I'm working on from my limited time in Ukraine before they threw me out. I'll be also going over to Nicaragua in next month for the anniversary of the Sandinista revolution. So I'll be doing some kind of work on that and the US attempts to destabilize and overthrow the Nicaraguan government and why that's failed. That's next. I'll be staying in Britain for a short period for now. That's kind of my next my next steps.
Excellent. Well, Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me tonight. It's just fascinating, and it's great to speak to someone who's determined to get on the ground and really trying to root out the truth. It's so refreshing. So really appreciate it. Keep doing the fantastic work, and hope to speak to you again very soon.
Lovely. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve.